Snowy evening to the museum. I'm Richard Hodges, the Williams director, and this is I think this is the fifth. Is it the fifth or the fourth in our Great Sites of the Ancient World series? We've been to Ur of the Chaldees and Bang Chang in Thailand. Last month we were at Troy, and tonight we're going to be in Abydos in Egypt, a site which is synonymous with many of the treasures that are in the museum. Tonight's speaker is Joe Wegner, who I suspect many of you know. He's the Associate Professor of Egyptian Archaeology here in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. He's also the Associate Curator of the Egyptian section. Joe studied at this university, got his undergraduate degree and his PhD here, working in Egyptology and working in particular on the sites of Saqqara and Abydos, where he's been digging since the early 1990s. He's written extensively on that site, as well as with his colleague David Silverman, on various other sites in the Middle Kingdom Egypt. And so it's a great pleasure, and indeed for me something of a novelty, because I haven't heard Joe speak about this. But this site and that particular alluring photograph, I hope, will help us to forget the snow and think about the wonders of great sites in the world. Joe.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here as part of the Great Sites series, and I certainly hope the site of Abydos is as great as many of the other ones that you've already heard about. Richard, thanks for your kind introduction. The site of Abydos is really an extremely important site in the study of ancient Egypt. It's one of the longest-lived important ceremonial centers in Egypt. It has its origins way back in the distant past of the pre-dynastic or the prehistoric period. Beginning roughly around 4000 BC, we can trace the development of many of the roots of Egyptian civilization at the site of Abydos. And through most of the dynastic period, from roughly 3000 BC through into late antiquity, in fact, into the late Roman period, Abydos was one of the central ceremonial or religious centers of Egyptian civilization. It's important to remember, in fact, that Egypt has its origins in prehistory, Abydos has its origins in prehistory, and in fact it's one of the very last, if not the last, places where the traditional gods of Egypt were worshipped in late antiquity. So we're going to journey to this wonderful site, away from taking you from our winter wonderland outside to the sun-baked deserts of southern Egypt. Where is Abydos? It's located in southern Egypt, about 300 miles south of the modern city of Cairo, that should be the right button. Just about 300 miles to the south of Memphis, which is roughly where modern Cairo is located, on the western side of the Nile River. We have this desert bay. You can see the situation of ancient Abydos. It's situated along the edge of the Nile floodplain, between the edge of the cultivation, extending over the region that we call the low desert, the flat sort of undulating sands that lead up to the high desert cliffs, as you see in that slide on the left-hand side. Here's a view of the environment of Abydos. It is a desert site. It is a very sandy place, and for that reason, Abydos is or has been associated or identified in its modern name as the buried Abydos. You see here the different names that we can use for Abydos. The modern name that we usually denote the site with is the Greek version, Abydos, which is actually a derivation upon the ancient Egyptian name for the site. The toponym for Abydos in Egyptian was Abju. And the modern name of the site is El Arab el-Madfuna, which means in Arabic the buried Abydos, or the buried Araba. And this refers to the sort of very sandy landscape. The sand-encumbered remains of Abydos extend over several square kilometers. And I should say that it's one of the most important, but in fact, in many respects, one of the least explored of the major Egyptian cities. because of this natural terrain that tends to encumber the ruins with sort of a cloak or blanket of sand that covers it. So here you see the environment of it. It's situated in the southern end of this vast desert bay and focused on, as you see in the upper part of the satellite image there, a desert valley that cuts out into the high desert cliffs. No one actually knows why the Egyptians called this place Abju. I have my theory, and one of the interesting features of the site, the topography of the site, as you kind of explore the terrain, the setting of this ancient ceremonial center. One of the very striking components of the landscape is this very prominent kind of natural cliff formation, which kind of dominates the setting of Abydos. You see it there, and one of the features of it, at least to my mind, is that it does kind of resemble a recumbent animal. And one of the possible derivations of the name Abju, which became Abydos as we know it through the Greek version, is that this could be translated as the mountain of the elephant, or elephant mountain. And to my mind, perhaps this sort of tripartite cliff formation looks almost as if you have a recumbent quadruped with the rump here, the midsection here, and the head here. And so this image that you see here actually superimposes a very early Egyptian rendition of an elephant body, giving you the sense of perhaps how the cliff gives the name Abju, or Elephant Mountain. It's a theory. I can't actually prove it, but otherwise we don't really have any explanation for the ancient name. So those are the various names by which Abydos is known. Okay, I obviously hit the wrong one again. Sorry. Okay, there we go. Abydos, why is it a great center? Why is it a great site? For many people, it has to do with this thousands of years of development through which we can trace the origins of Egyptian civilization and the development of it through time into late antiquity. For other people, though, Abydos is a great place because of these unfortunate hieroglyphs that some of you may be familiar with. These damnable helicopters and spaceships have become associated with Abydos in the popular imagination. One of the great temples of ancient Abydos is this magnificent building, the Temple of Seti the First of the 19th dynasty from Egypt's New Kingdom. This is the major tourist monument that you'll visit if you go to Abydos. It's arguably the most beautiful temple in Egypt. When you walk into its interior, you see the beautifully preserved, painted reliefs that decorate it. But on the outside of it, we do have these inscriptions which, over the course of time and through perhaps the careful sort of defacing by someone, a defacer of monuments has altered these hieroglyphs to resemble the form of a helicopter. You see here what looks like a tank, according to this interpretation, and something like a submarine or a spaceship. And it's quite amazing when you go onto the internet just how many websites actually are devoted to these enigmatic spaceships and helicopters. For a lot of people, it proves that the ancient Egyptians invented flying machines and, of course, naturally had connections with extraterrestrials if they were able to do so. For Egyptologists, this is just rather infuriating because it really takes away from the true interest of this magnificent monument of Seti, which is one of the great temples of ancient Abydos. So we don't really believe that has much to do with the greatness of Abydos. Why is it a great site? Ultimately, it comes down to this very unassuming looking place. If you move out into the low desert, beyond the fields, out towards the high desert cliffs, you'll see here the entrance to that desert valley that I pointed out just a little bit ago. Right in front of this entrance to the high desert, you see these undulating mounds. mounds and depressions which are covered with millions upon millions of pottery vessels. This is one of the most important sites of early Egypt. This is a site known as el-Gab in modern Arabic, which means the mother of pots, or the mother of broken pottery, as you might want to translate it. And it comes from the fact that the whole surface of the site is littered with these millions upon millions of pottery vessels. You can't actually appreciate this aspect of the site unless you walk over the surface. And if you do so, you really do get a sense of the ground literally giving birth to pottery. Because the pottery doesn't just litter the surface, but it's buried in huge, deep deposits. And if you just kind of walk around these mounds, broken pots and sometimes whole pots will just come kind of falling out of the ground at you, as if the ground is giving birth. So literally the mother of pottery is a quite apt description of this particular place. El-Gab is the location of what you can think of as the first Valley of the Kings, before the famous tombs of kings like Tutankhamun and Ramses the Great in Luxor. Way before that, thousands of years back, El-Gab at Abydos was the first Valley of the Kings, literally the first necropolis of Egypt's pharaohs. And that is kind of the basis for the significance of Abydos. Its significance arises way back before the historical or dynastic period. In fact, in the period from roughly 4000 BC up to about 3000 BC, we can trace the development of El-Gab as sort of a family necropolis, a royal burial ground of powerful local leaders who seem to have been very instrumental in the early formative period of Egyptian civilization. By the end of the pre-dynastic period, from roughly 3300 BC up to the beginning of what we call Dynasty I, a series of sort of proto-pharaohs. We're not in the historical periods at this point, but tombs obviously being used to bury extremely powerful local leaders who have many of the features that we would associate with later kings. They're being buried here, and they seem to be basically developing Abydos as their royal burial ground. One of the kings that was buried there is a very famous one who's been identified tentatively as a king scorpion, and his tomb has probably become the most famous of the early tombs, the pre-dynastic tombs of the sort of the precursors to Egypt's pharaohs. This is called Tomb Uj. It's a multi-chambered tomb which contains vast amounts of funerary offerings. It had a burial chamber, which is at the upper part of the slide there, that the final kind of rectangular chamber at the far end of the image that you see there. And it's also made famous because this is the location of the earliest evidence for Egyptian hieroglyphs. You see these ivory tags or labels with perforated holes in them. These are the earliest examples of Egyptian hieroglyphs being used in a kind of administrative or record-keeping system attached to objects that were buried in connection with this proto-pharaoh's tomb. The proto-pharaohs, however, seem to have been the precursors to the actual kind of really pivotal kings that brought Egypt into the historical or dynastic period. And this is really kind of the heart of ancient Abydos. Continuing the development of its pre-dynastic cemeteries, we have what we call the early dynastic cemetery, which includes a number of kind of mammoth underground mud brick tombs that are cut down into the low desert. You can see one of them here, which is the tomb of King Den of the first dynasty. Gigantic burial chambers that are cut down into the subsurface, surrounded by chambers that were filled with goods that accompanied the king in death, and also surrounding sacrificial burials, people that for a brief period of time, sacrifice was being practiced in the first dynasty, retainers and other individuals who accompanied the early pharaohs. in their burials at Umm el-Gab. So these are these figures of the first dynasty from roughly around 3000 BC to 2800 BC in approximate dates. These are kind of really the pivotal unifier figures of Egypt. These were the pharaohs that, to the Egyptian mind, unified their kingdom. They were the founders of Egyptian civilization, and they are commemorated. Their tombs are at Umm el-Gab, and they're also commemorated or recorded in one of the very significant discoveries that's been made in recent decades. The German Institute in Egypt has been conducting excavations here for many years. One of their important discoveries were a series of necropolis seals, seals of the actual royal cemetery that record the names in sequence of these early pharaohs. They include figures like the famous King Narmer, who many of you may know from the Narmer palette. He is a king who's often connected with the historical figure named Menes. In Egyptian histories, they recount that the unification of the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt, the formation of the unified kingdom, is attributed to King Menes, and Narmer has often been associated with him. His successor, there you see the Narmer palette and Narmer's name, which occurs on this necropolis seal. One of the other kings that succeeds him, King Aha, whose name is right here. His name means the fighter, or the valiant one. This particular pharaoh, according to later histories, was the actual founder of the city of Memphis, which becomes the major capital city in later dynasties. So these are really pivotal political figures. The first kings, they were thought about by later Egyptians as kind of the real establishers of their civilization. And once Abydos had become the burial ground for the first pharaohs, that largely sealed its fate. What happened to it in later millennia is associated with its symbolic relationship to these founding pharaohs. From this point onwards, Abydos doesn't really have any kind of major political influence. It wasn't one of the great sort of populated cities of Egypt. It doesn't seem to have evolved into kind of a major population center, but it was always kind of at the heart of Egyptian ideas of the origin of their civilization, and develops this kind of ceremonial and religious role in later times, and that's a derivation of the fact that the first pharaohs are buried there. Just to look at some of the evidence from these tombs, there's a lot of debate about what they looked like, but we do know that they were underground burials. The burial chambers of the first pharaohs were subterranean. They had some kind of superstructure, which is highly debated. The above-ground features are not preserved. It may have taken the form of kind of a low mound, or perhaps what we call a mastaba. We do know that these places were marked and designated by the names of the actual kings that were buried there, by these wonderful stelae, markers that have the name of the king, which usually has the serech, or the paneled facade, with the name of the king inside of it, and sort of an emblem of the god Horus, the falcon god, who is sort of the divine emblem of the living king. These markers were set up in front of or adjacent to the actual tombs. Some of you may be aware that we have a wonderful example of one of these up in the Lower Egyptian Gallery. I'm sure many of you have seen it. We actually have one of the tomb stelae from King Ka'a, who's the final king of Dynasty 1. Dating to around 2800 BC. In case you've never noticed it, if you make your way up to Lower Egypt after the talk, be sure to take a look at it. It looks very similar to these ones. el-Gab was a very rich necropolis. The fragmentary remains that have been recovered, both 100 years ago, the famous excavator Flinders Petrie worked there. More recently, the work of the German Institute has produced many wonderful finds. You can see the excavation of the largest of the tombs at el-Gab, which is the tomb of King Khasa Kemwi. Khafre is almost certainly the father of King Djoser, the famous builder of the step pyramid at Saqqara. And Khafre built this mammoth underground tomb that was seemingly equipped with just astounding quantities of riches, some of the fragments that were left by ancient tomb robbers, the bad stuff that they either dropped or didn't bother with. You can see in these beautiful stone vessels with gold foil lids and seals still in place. We're also lucky enough to have in the collection a number of examples of these, and also in the case, the early Egypt case, which is right adjacent to the stela of King Ka in Lower Egypt. Be sure to take a look in there, and there are some of the examples of both material from King Khafre's tomb, as well as some of the early labels, like those from the possible proto-King Scorpion from Tomb Uj. Okay, so very richly equipped and beautiful tombs originally. These tombs are connected with a number of enigmatic enclosures, which are located not directly adjacent to Gab, but removed at some distance, actually right at the very edge of the floodplain or the fields. We have these monstrous mud brick enclosures. These have been the focus of work of my colleague and advisor David O'Connor, who's been conducting work at the site there since 1967. These are what we call funerary enclosures that seem to be associated with early mortuary ceremonies of these first kings. We believe that there probably were final rites, burial rites that were conducted in these mud brick enclosures prior to the actual burial of the body of the king out in the desert at Gab. Most of them haven't been preserved, but there's one kind of monstrous example of one of these, which is the funerary enclosure of King Khafre, the same king whose tomb you just saw. It actually matches the scale of his underground tomb. It's currently being restored as part of the work of the Pennsylvania Yale Institute of Fine Arts NYU expedition to Abydos. No one's quite sure exactly how these were used, but undoubtedly part of the ceremonial activities of these early pharaohs. And also connected with them are the somewhat famous boat burials that were discovered in 1991. This was actually my first experience in Egypt. I went out with David O'Connor to Abydos, and the first thing I worked on ever in Egypt was the sight of these boats. And it did spoil me a little bit, I guess, the first season there, to come upon the earliest examples of wooden boats in Egypt, these side-by-side burial structures inside of which internally these contain the hulls of very big wooden boats that were probably part of the funerary ceremonies of these kings. So, as I said, my expectations are high every time I go out to Abydos. And in fact, Abydos is a place that doesn't disappoint because of the fact that you have these sort of concealing sands, El Arab al-Madfuna, as I mentioned. There are magnificent discoveries lurking all around Abydos. Okay, so Gab is the basis for Abydos and its importance as Egypt enters the dynastic or historical period. And what's interesting about Abydos is really what happens after the period of the first pharaohs, the way the Egyptians thought about this and continued to remember the fact that their earliest kings were buried there. What happened, essentially, is that over time, I guess to quote a famous writer of fantasy literature, history became legend and legend became myth. Within just a couple hundred years, by the time you get to the Old Kingdom and the reign of King Cheops, or Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid at Giza, the Egyptians had begun to associate Abydos with one specific deity who is shown on the right here. This is the famous god of the Netherworld, or the king of the afterlife, the god Osiris. The Egyptians seem to have basically sort of forgotten in a way over time who the specific kings were who were buried out at Gob. It's a little debatable exactly how they thought about this, but one of the clear developments is that they began to believe that the archetypal divine king, Osiris, was in fact buried in the necropolis of the first pharaohs. The reason they believe that is Osiris himself is in fact symbolically the sort of divine notion of the idea of an ancient pharaoh king, a god pharaoh who had actually gone through a process of death and treatment of his body, and then sort of rebirth into an afterlife existence. And Abydos becomes linked with Osiris, probably through virtue of the fact that you have these very, very ancient kings of Egypt's sort of formative period, and the sort of the religious lens through which the Egyptians viewed this place came to associate Osiris with Abydos. Osiris is a really interesting figure, and it's important to recognize that for the Egyptians, Osiris wasn't just a god, but he was in fact a historical being, a god king from the beginning of time, and also a being who continued to exert critical kind of structuring influence on the cosmos and the nature of kind of the existence, both living and the afterlife that the Egyptians understood or desired to participate in. Osiris is critical to that. The significance of Osiris is best understood through a brief examination of the myth of Osiris. And many of you will probably be familiar with Osiris and his sort of problematical family. Osiris is one of a number of 4 children who were born, according to Egyptian religious beliefs, to the god Geb and his wife, the sky goddess Nut. And these 4 siblings that you see here, Osiris was the eldest of them. They composed male and female pairs. And according to the myth of Osiris, Osiris was married to his sister, the goddess Isis. You see here the second one there, paired with Osiris. Isis is a goddess who is kind of the archetypal woman figure, which you can actually see through the fact that they name her, the hieroglyph, which shows a throne or a chair placed on top of her head, is a writing for the ancient Egyptian word for woman. She is the goddess woman. So the archetypal woman is married to the archetypal god king, Osiris. And Osiris, according to the myth, ruled in sort of these ancient utopian times when the gods ruled over the world. But the myth of Osiris recounts the fact that the brother of Osiris, the infamous god Seth, who you see here, a mysterious figure with a long pointy nose and these ears that stick way up. No one's sure exactly what he is. A mythical animal of some form. Some people have speculated that there may be some extinct Seth animal that's the basis for this creature. Whatever the case, Seth is the jealous brother of Osiris, and a little bit like the Cain and Abel story of the Old Testament. Seth planned to murder Osiris, and in fact did murder Osiris. He fooled Osiris into kind of laying down in a coffin or sarcophagus, which had been designed just to fit perfectly the proportions of Osiris's body. He sealed it shut and he drowned his brother in the Nile, at which point, according to the myth, Isis and her sister, Nephthys, this lady here, the other member of this quartet of gods. She's the sister of Isis, but also the wife of Seth. these two women then searched out the body of Osiris. They rediscovered it, and they hid it away from Seth. But Seth found out about this and actually caused, for a second time, the death of Osiris. He dismembered his brother's corpse, shredding it into pieces, and Isis and Nephthys thereupon had to find all the pieces of Osiris's body. And this is, according to Egyptian myths, Egyptian religious ideas, this is the first event of mummification. It's the origin of mummification. The myth of Osiris recounts the treatment of this dismembered divine god-king, the treatment of his body in this moment after his second death. This occurs, according to the myth, through the activities of the jackal god Anubis, who you see in this slide, standing right behind Osiris. The myth does become quite elaborate and has many kind of juicy details to it that I don't have time to go into. But one of the interesting parts of it is that in the process of searching out and recovering the dismembered body of Osiris, Isis was able to recover all of the parts except for one critical element. There was one missing item. The male member of Osiris was not discovered. In fact, the myth tells us that the penis of Osiris fell into the Nile, where it was gobbled up by fish. And the Egyptians, in fact, considered fish to be the uncleanest of food. Although they ate a lot of fish, they believed that fish were unclean because of this unfortunate snack that they had. And so Isis was forced to, in fact, create a prosthetic appendage. She fashioned a fake penis out of clay and linen, and Osiris's mummified corpse had this attached to it. And here, in the kind of the final stages of Osiris's life on earth, occurred a divine moment, the impregnation of Isis upon the corpse of Osiris. You see this periodically in Egyptian temples and tomb relief. Here you see in this scene, which is from the Seti Temple at Abydos, the mummified body of Osiris with Isis, who has taken the form of a falcon hovering over the erect penis of Osiris, impregnating herself on the body. This is, as I say here, their final intimate moment, what the Egyptians would call spending a happy hour together before Osiris went on his way. It is critical, though, because the impregnation of Isis allowed her to give birth to the heir of Osiris, Osiris's heir, the god Horus, who you see here in this group of three gods, the falcon god. Horus, who, like his mother, takes the form of a falcon. He's the son of Osiris in an Egyptian religious ideas. Osiris is the incarnation of the dead king who has been mummified and gone into the tomb, whereas Horus is the incarnation or divine. Horus is the divine kind of model for the living king, the exerciser of the throne of Egypt. The inheritor of Osiris. So these are some of the basic aspects of the myth. And the myth of Osiris is extremely critical to understanding ancient Abydos because Osiris is not just the king of the Netherworld, but he is sort of the key to ancient Egyptian hopes for what will happen to them after they die. The Egyptians were keenly aware that life is short, but death is eternal. And for them, one of the keys to eternal salvation and the ability to have some kind of eternal, endless or ongoing existence once you die is rooted in the ideas associated with Osiris. For kings as well as common people throughout Egyptian history, you want to associate yourself with Osiris, and you often see these images of pharaohs connecting themselves, as you see with King Tut here, for example, with Osiris in the Netherworld. Osiris, when he died and journeyed into a Netherworld existence, in fact, according to Egyptian myth, became the Lord of the afterlife. He's the pharaoh of the Netherworld. The goal of a lot of Egyptian religion, whether it be funerary texts like these, the coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom, or the famous Book of the Dead, the goal is to enter the realm of Osiris and to associate with yourself with Osiris and to kind of mimic Osiris. What happened to him is the divine model for approaching and achieving an eternal existence. So the Egyptians think of Osiris as a really kind of key individual, divine individual, and for as regards Abydos, what's really interesting is that they, by the time certainly of the Middle Kingdom, if not before, they began to identify one of the specific tombs at Gab as the actual tomb of Osiris himself. And this is the tomb of King Jer, who's one of the kings of the first dynasty. We know that his tomb was viewed as the tomb of Osiris because inside of it, they actually did sort of ancient archaeology where they excavated the tomb of this ancient pharaoh and placed inside of it all sorts of votive objects. One of the most interesting is this wonderful stone image, three-dimensional rendition of the mummified body of Osiris, as very similar to the temple scene that you saw from the Seti Temple, where Osiris's mummy is laying on the funerary bed, or mummification bed, and he's being visited here, as you can see, again, by Isis in the form of a falcon. Certainly by the time of the Middle Kingdom, the tomb of Jer was identified as the tomb of Osiris. And at that time, there developed a important religious festival, an annual procession, which actually started in a temple, a main temple that had been built in the ancient city or main town of Abydos that led out through the desert to the necropolis of the first pharaohs. And every year there was this annual Osiris procession that commemorated the myth of Osiris. Stages of this festival actually reenacted kind of key sections, key events in the whole myth of Osiris. We know quite a bit about it beginning in the Middle Kingdom because at that time, one particular pharaoh, who's the pharaoh who's in fact closest to my heart, as you'll come to understand by the end of the lecture, this dour-looking king here on the left, Senwosret or Sesostris the Third. He is a king of the 12th dynasty, reigning roughly about 1880 to 1840 BC, as you can see. He took an unusual interest in the cult of Osiris. Many kings had a lot of interest in it, but his sort of exceeded that. And he chose his royal treasurer, one of the high officials of his court, sending him down to Abydos with the instructions that he had to completely rebuild the temple of Osiris, refurbish kind of the ritual equipment, the statue of the god, various other ritual implements that were used in the worship of Osiris. And it's recounted in a wonderful stela, which is in Berlin, the stela of Echernofret. Echernofret was the treasurer of Senwosret III, and you can see part of this here. My majesty commands you to go to Abydos, to raise there a monument for my father Osiris, and to complete his sacred image out of the gold which he ordered my majesty to bring back from Nubia in triumphant victory. Senwosret III periodically campaigned in Nubia and returned victoriously with lots of booty, including gold, which went into the cult of Osiris. Echernofret, in the stela, the main interesting part of it, in fact, recounts Echernofret's participation in the sacred rituals of Osiris. Part of it talks about how he conducted the sacred, what's called the Neshmet bark, which is that divine bark that you see on the upper left there. This was a divine bark that contained a shrine inside of which was an image of the god, which would be conducted out to the presumed burial place of Osiris in the early dynastic necropolis at Gab. So he talks about in the stela how he, in fact, took part of this. And there are many parts both of the stela and other religious inscriptions that allow us to reconstruct in quite a bit of detail the different components of the ceremony, the annual ceremony of Osiris. Part of it, as you can see in this quotation here, included sort of a reliving of the mourning of the passing of the ancient god king. One of the things that happened when he finally went into the Netherworld journeyed off for the last time, is that he was mourned by Isis and Nephthys. These two goddesses became the sort of prototypical mourning women, and as part of the rituals, the annual procession of Osiris, there was a reliving or acting out of Isis and Nephthys mourning the passing of Osiris. So it was very, very elaborate. And this annual festival became one of the key points of ancient Abydos. But beyond that, in fact, sort of, not just annually, but year-round, Abydos evolves into a place where a lot of people desire to tap into the kind of the eternal symbolism of Osiris. He becomes kind of the mechanism through which you can hope for eternal salvation and eternal existence. One of the things that you often see in funerary scenes is something that's called the Voyage to Abydos. People occasionally did make long-distance trips to Abydos to visit the site. In fact, all of those pottery vessels that you see littering the landscape of Gab are the offering pottery that were left by ancient pilgrims to the site, but even people that couldn't go there would hope symbolically to take part in this. And funerary scenes often incorporate what's called the voyage or journey to and from Abydos, where there's a boat that contains often a man and wife who will go to Abydos and take part in the rituals of Osiris. Many people, in fact, did do this, or at least put into place features that would allow them to make this kind of eternal association with Osiris. One of the very important parts of the site are a series of private, what we call cenotaphs, symbolic sort of ritual buildings that are clustered right adjacent to the temple, the ancient temple of Osiris, and right next to the processional route that connected the temple with the burial ground of Osiris. People hoped if they established some kind of structure in this location that they could tap into the magical potency of this place. These cenotaphs were decorated or outfitted with stelae and statues that commemorated people in sort of a mortuary setting. Most of them don't actually have burials connected with them. They're cenotaphs or symbolic structures. And so they link people eternally with Osiris. Abydos became essentially a place where everybody, sort of the full kind of spectrum of Egyptian society, tried to connect themselves with the mortuary connotations of Osiris. The structures range from those tiny cenotaphs, as you just saw, through grand temples, like this magnificent temple of Seti the First. Here you see, I know some of you in the audience have visited the place. In case you haven't, the image there in the center just gives you a sense for the magnificent painted relief which decorates this temple. It's a gigantic monument dedicated to the veneration of Osiris, especially in connection with a lot of other gods. And very explicit in the Seti Temple is part of kind of the kingly interest in Abydos, which is linking oneself as the ruler of Egypt's present with the past rulers of the country, one's divine ancestors, the kings of the past, going all the way back to the first founder of the kingdom, the first name that you see in this gigantic long list is King Menes. King Menes, who I mentioned before, is symbolically thought of as the unifier of the kingdom. And in the Seti Temple at Abydos, there's this wonderful chamber. In fact, well, it's a corridor or hall, in fact, where we have this king list. And there's an image of Seti and his son Ramses II venerating the divine ancestors. So all of the kings that they thought were good kings, worthy kings, are commemorated here. A lot of kings that they didn't think really deserved to be on the list were simply excised, left out. So it's a sort of an annotated history of Egypt, but nevertheless a major king list and one of the most extensive temple or ceremonial lists of pharaohs that we have from ancient Egypt. The range of amazing structures at Abydos, including ones that one might never have suspected would be there, is quite significant. Right behind the Seti Temple is this wonderful monument called the Osirion, which is a subterranean structure. You can see the Seti Temple looming up sort of behind the back wall of it on the left slide there. This subterranean structure called the Osirion is actually a symbolic rendition of kind of archaic or ancient architecture that's meant to symbolize the kind of setting that the Egyptians thought that Osiris might want to be associated with. It's actually aligned with the burial place of the first pharaohs out at Umm el-Gab. And it's a kind of religious symbolic monument that again connects the king with Osiris in death. Many people over the ages have been inspired by Abydos, and they include some nowadays famous figures. One person who sort of is irrevocably connected with Osiris and Abydos is this famous lady on the left, Sethi. She was a rather eccentric English woman who was inspired at a fairly young age basically by Egyptian, a visit to the British Museum, I believe, in fact, inspired her to sort of make sort of a mystical connection with ancient Egypt, and she moved to Abydos and lived right next to the Seti Temple for many, many years. And on the walls of the Seti Temple are these reliefs that show the stages of the ancient temple ritual, and she used these as the basis for actually reconstructing the rites of temple worship. She died in the 1980s, but there's a whole host of followers of Sethi that most people don't know about, actually. In fact, several dozen people nowadays who go to the temple of Osiris, the Seti Temple, and enact these rituals. So this lady, for example, here on the right, who seems to have dropped her lunch, she's not actually just picking up her lunch, but those are offerings to Osiris. She's doing rituals inside one of the chambers. Modern people who are inspired by the Osiris rituals and have tried to reenact them, and they still come to the site today. All right, in the final part of the lecture, I want to turn away from the discussion of Osiris and Abydos and look specifically at some of the features of my own research. King Senwosret III, who I mentioned, my favorite king, this dour-faced individual. He is this pharaoh who is notable for having taken a specific kind of elevated level of interest in the worship of Osiris. Senwosret III appears to be the first pharaoh of Egypt after the early dynastic kings who actually came back to Abydos for the purpose of burial. And we know that because to the south of the core of Abydos, in this area here that we call South Abydos, we have the remains of a very extensive mortuary complex that was built by Senwosret III, which has as its focus a subterranean tomb, which is built up at the base of the cliffs in this location that you see here. And that tomb is the focal point for a very extensive complex that includes a mortuary temple down near the floodplain, which you can see in the process of excavation. Also connected with it is a large town site, a settlement, which is located here along the desert edge, which housed a significant population of people, probably at its height several thousand people, involved in the eternal mortuary cult of Senwosret the Third. Senwosret the Third built this mortuary monument complex at South Abydos, probably partially out of his specific interest in Osiris and as an expression of kind of new ideas about how the king wants to kind of connect with Osiris in the attempt to gain kind of an eternal afterlife. We know that the place is specifically connected with the idea of the eternal existence of the deceased king Senwosret III, because it actually has a wonderful name, which is also kind of a tongue twister. In ancient Egyptian, this place was called Wasit Chakara Ma'acheru Em Abju, which translates, as you can see there, approximately as enduring or everlasting are the places of Chakare. Chakare is one of the names of Senwosret III, true of voice in Abydos. It establishes a place of eternal existence for this king, Senwosret III. We've been working there as part of the Pennsylvania, Yale, NYU expedition. I started work there in 1994, and it's an ongoing research project which probably has no end. I probably will spend my entire career at this place. The quality of the archaeological remains there are so extensive, and the site is so large, and the potential for new information is so great that I envision being there for many decades yet to come. One of the features of the site that we've looked at is this wonderful mortuary temple, which you see here in reconstruction, which was dedicated to the mortuary cult of this king, Senwosret III. It was named Beautiful as the Ka, spirit of the king. And the people that lived in the nearby town were the population of administrators and priests and personnel that maintained this king's cult on the southern end of Abydos. One of the major sources of information is this beautifully preserved, for this period in time, settlement site. It's a state-planned or government-planned settlement, which you can see is composed of these blocks of many sort of similar-looking or similarly planned houses arrayed in along kind of a rectilinear urban plan. The major structure, the largest building, though, is a very exciting one that we first started working on in 1994 and have almost completed. There are probably 2 more seasons' work to complete the investigation of this building. It's actually an ancient mayor's palace, a gigantic building that once was used as kind of the administrative center and also the personal habitation, the house, in fact, of the mayor. And here you see some of the remains of this. I do like to remind people that these remains at Abydos come from roughly 2000 BC. This is not Pompeii. This is not a place that was covered by volcanic ash. It's a place that suffered over the last 4 millennia, but nevertheless, for this particular period of time, this is a very, very well-preserved building, and it's giving us a lot of information on life in ancient Abydos. We're able to reconstruct a lot of the functions of the building, which you can see here, parts of in reconstruction, and also kind of the local history of this part of Abydos. It was run by a series of mayors who are commemorated on inscribed objects and also clay seal impressions. These impressions on clay, you can see these hieroglyphs here, are administrative seals that record the names and titles of a series of mayors, and we're able to reconstruct kind of the local history of the place. And the mayor's house has given us wonderful insights into features of life 4,000 years ago in Abydos. One of the completely unpredictable discoveries is this beautiful decorated mud brick, which is the only extant example of an ancient birth brick. Egyptian women would give, when they delivered children, would do so while squatting on top of a brick, as you see in this depiction from later in time, in fact from a Greco-Roman period temple, but you would squat on top of these bricks, and this brick that we recovered from the mayor's house is an actual birth brick that probably belongs to a Set, and it's decorated with magical imagery, a series of gods and demons and creatures, similar to what you see on these famous objects, well known to Egyptologists at least. Magical wands or magical knives, and we can study the imagery on this birth brick to reconstruct the religious ideas of birth and how the Egyptians tried to kind of tap into divine forces to beneficially influence the outcome of childbirth. Here's a reconstruction of the main scene on the birth brick, which shows a new mother holding her baby, and some incarnations of or symbols that represent the presence of the goddess Hathor, this bovine goddess here, and these female figures who are probably, in fact, trying to represent themselves as incarnations of Hathor herself as part of the birth rituals, very similar to what you see in this later scene where Hathor helps this lady. These balanced Hathor figures are taking part in childbirth. So the mayor's house is producing a lot of interesting insight into life at this time period in Egypt. But one of the features of work in the mayor's house is that there's an awful lot of material that comes out of it. In the last couple seasons, we've been working on primarily study and documentation of the small objects, a lot of it's pottery. And as we're doing that, I decided that the time was right to go to up to the cliffs and undertake the beginnings of a lengthy process of excavating the conceptual focus of this complex of Osiris the Third, which is this underground tomb, the subterranean tomb that you see here, up at the base of the cliffs, is located inside of this large T-shaped funerary enclosure. And the tomb had actually been entered 100 years ago by two Egyptologists who discovered that there's a gigantic mortuary structure that extends down about 100 feet below the desert surface and then extending 800 feet below the cliff that you see looming behind the site there. They discovered that the tomb had been robbed in ancient times, and the place was just left 100 years ago. 1904 was the last time it was entered. And in 2001, and then especially in 2004, we conducted work at the site with the goal of reopening and conducting an extensive kind of scientific investigation of this major tomb. One of the very exciting discoveries that we made is an ancient toponym, a place name, or a divine designation that ties it in with the myth of Osiris that I talked about earlier. We discovered that the Egyptians viewed this place as having a divine connection with the god Anubis, the mummifier god. And there's in fact, a Necropolis seal, like the earlier Necropolis seals of the first pharaohs, that names Anubis Mountain. This peak that soars up over the site of the tomb probably is being connected with the mummifier god of Osiris, who also has sort of a protective role in the royal burial. And it's below this sacred mountain of Anubis that the tomb extends. Here's what it looks like, roughly 800 feet from its entrance to its inner termination. The kind of the inner half of it is directly below the cliffs, extending in a westerly direction. Why return to this site and excavate it. It appears to be a very important and sort of pivotal royal mortuary monument, which helps to decode or understand questions of how the Egyptian tomb, the royal tomb, evolves over time. And one of the important transformations that does happen is the abandonment of the traditional pyramid. Many of you are familiar with the pyramids of Giza, the pyramids of the early periods. At some point, the Egyptians placed less emphasis on the existence of a superstructure above the tomb. This particular tomb at Abydos is the first royal tomb that abandons the built pyramid. In fact, it's a hidden tomb, a subterranean tomb, and what they seem to be doing is substituting an element of the landscape, this mountain of Anubis, in place of the built pyramid. So we've been excavating this over the course of 3 seasons now. It looked like this when we started excavation on the site. In 100 years, it had completely filled in with sand. It took about 6 months of excavation just to get down to the bedrock, which is the location that you see here, into which the entrance system into this underground tomb is constructed. So it's a very difficult place to work. It involves a lot of labor, as you can see. A couple of you in the audience, I think, may have been part of the Museum Women's Committee tour that visited us during the wonderful weather that we were having in May out in Abydos. And a few of you actually were courageous enough to scamper down into the interior of the tomb. But here you see some of the work over the last few seasons. And I'll just finish up the lecture taking a look at what this excavation looks like. It's a quite amazing site. The first thing that you think of the first thing you think when you visit here is, good Lord, what were these people thinking? This gigantic rock-cut structure that goes down into the bedrock. The whole thing was full of debris and sand, and we've excavated it out over the last few seasons. It is a very fun place to visit, of course, and you see my wife Jennifer there descending down the sloping entrance passage that takes you down into the interior, and you'll notice, of course, the distinct similarity that she has in her mode of entrance to the tomb with Angelina Jolie there from the well-known movie. Jennifer is sliding down into this magnificent underground tomb, 800 feet of architecture that's not just rock cut, but in fact much of this tomb is lined with gigantic slabs of masonry, granite, quartzite, and limestone that had to be brought from hundreds of miles away and brought down into this very cumbersome kind of entrance system that takes you 100 feet below the desert surface. So just a few shots of the last season. One of the things you encounter when you enter the tomb of Wasit the Third are the guardians, of course. The Netherworld has guardians, and you have to pass by the gatekeepers. So here they are. This is part of the excavation work on the first chamber, which you see behind these guys. This beautifully decorated, where the ceiling carved to simulate wooden poles or logs running across the width of the chamber, all constructed out of limestone masonry that's fitted inside of the rock-cut cavity of the tomb. This is the slide we started with. The first chamber of the inside is this magnificent, what we call the pole roof chamber, which you see in the process of excavation. One of the exciting parts of this excavation is, in fact, I usually tell people that I do normally prefer kind of a bit more of a sort of a subtle type of excavation, a place where there's a lot of detail in small, thin levels of stratigraphy, but we don't have that in the tomb here. What we have is gigantic chambers filled with the debris of ancient tomb robbers and lots of kind of wrecked blocking stones and massive massive elements of masonry that had been dislodged by tomb robbers. So it's a very sort of different type of excavation to what we're doing in the town site, but nevertheless a pretty fun type of excavation as well. The testosterone levels in this excavation are pretty high. The air inside the tomb is basically saturated with testosterone. These guys just love this kind of work. I offered several times for these guys to go above ground and do some of the work that we're doing at the top, up top as well, but they had no interest. They'd rather remain down here and do the manly work, as they described it. Anyway, what we've achieved in terms of the work so far is the excavation of the first section of this magnificent monument. At the end of the last season, we had completed the excavation of this pole roof chamber and two chambers that lead off to either side of it. There's just the entrance as it looked last season, and this beautiful architecture, which is a sort of an archaic style or evocation of archaic architecture that's associated probably with Osiris. Another view of the entrance coming down into the tomb. Some of the other chambers, beautiful vaulted chambers that are located adjacent to this pole roof chamber. Bits and pieces of material that indicates quite clearly that in fact this was a tomb that was used for the burial of the pharaoh, including fragments of alabaster canopic jars that were used for the burial of the inner organs of the king. And just to look at some of the inner parts of the tomb, beyond the area that we've excavated so far, the tomb continues in a series of magnificent chambers. The central part of the tomb has these gigantic limestone chambers that connect through a sloping passageway with the burial chamber, which contains still today the sarcophagus and the canopic chest of Wasit the Third, gigantic blocking stones that had been dislodged by ancient tomb robbers. You can see this blocked passageway leading down into the burial chamber, which we actually have yet to excavate, but there's Jennifer sitting in it. You can see it's very, very dirty. I don't know if a couple of you made it as far as this when you visited during the summer. Unfortunately, Wasit the Third is not there. You can climb inside of his sarcophagus, and the mummy is gone. Tomb robbers stripped the place in antiquity, but we're looking for any kind of shreds and bits of evidence that indicate the types of furnishings that were associated with the original use of the tomb, and some views of the inner end. The burial chamber of Wasit the Third. Beyond it, the tomb actually continues in a sort of a magnificent curving passageway that terminates in these gigantic chambers that tomb robbers anciently ripped apart. These final two chambers in the tomb were fitted with huge blocks of red quartzite. You can see the flooring of this huge chamber here that was actually tunneled into, and the floor was pulled apart. This is one giant flooring block, and these are two other ones that originally sat down together. And the walls, you can just get a sense of the walls of this particular chamber. The place was ransacked by ancient tomb robbers looking for treasure. And so as we go through the excavation of this tomb, we're also looking for evidence for the process of robbery. One of the really fascinating questions about this tomb is its role in the kind of the development of the royal tomb and how it relates to Abydos. And what seems to be the case here is that the king at this time is thinking very kind of critically about Osiris and his role in kind of the afterlife, the eternal existence of the king. And as usually happens in Egyptian religion, things are quite complex. In fact, they're much more complex than they seem at first glance. And Osiris is not sort of the be-all, end-all of the afterlife. Osiris in Egyptian religion is sort of not just the god of the netherworld, but he's also the agent or the mechanism for one of the most important religious kind of processes that happens in allowing the cosmos to continue. And this is something that happens in the midpoint of the night. In the 6th hour of the night, according to ancient Egyptian texts, occurs a mystical moment when Osiris and the sun god merge, and there's this momentary kind of moment, this regeneration, where the power of Osiris and his ability to be reborn is imbued upon the sun god. And this allows the sun, when it sets in the evening and goes, in Egyptian conceptions, under the world, it allows it to regenerate and, in fact, to be reborn every morning on the eastern horizon. This is one of the critical moments in Egyptian religious ideas, and for Egyptian pharaohs, it becomes the key moment that they want to participate in. And I believe, my theory is that this tomb at Abydos is the first kind of fully articulated expression in architecture of the netherworld passage of the king to participate in this moment of mystical union. And in the tomb, in the midpoint of the tomb, we have this hidden sarcophagus chamber that you saw Jennifer sitting in the sarcophagus. Earlier, it may be an evocation of what the Egyptians call the At Imanet, the hidden chamber of the union of Re and Osiris. At Abydos, King Wasit the Third may be coming there, a place that has a very long history going back to the earliest pharaohs. This association with Osiris, but developing a new and sort of innovative tomb that is basically kind of a magical mechanism to allow him to participate in this midpoint, this moment of union of Re and Osiris, and to be reborn eternally. So we can look at the site and get some impression of kind of the long-term memories of the past that go back to the beginnings of Egyptian civilization, the first pharaohs that certainly Wasit the Third would have honored, but also the religious lens that they view this place through, their interpretation of Abydos as the burial ground of Osiris, and thereby the place that kings can relate themselves to the netherworld symbolism of kingship, and also the ability of Osiris to allow the king to merge or associate with the sun god and undergo this cosmic rebirth, which is the basis for his eternal existence in the afterlife. So memory and hope for the future are certainly elements that carry through in the way that Wasit the Third is developing this site at Abydos. All right, so that's going to bring my lecture to a close. I thank you all for your attention, and I'd be happy to, if we have time, to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Wonderful talk. Could you tell us why Abydos? Why you've shown us these marvelous monuments almost in the middle of the desert? Mm-hmm. Why there?
Well, it goes back to the fact that the royal necropolis was situated there. We believe that Abydos was in origin part of a sort of a complex of sites, and originally, back in the most ancient past, there's a city called Thinis, which was the political capital of these earliest pharaohs before Memphis became the capital. And Abydos was the necropolis site for Thinis. No one's ever found Thinis. It's thought to have been along the Nile and is probably deeply buried under the alluvium. But as Abydos developed as the royal cemetery, it then evolves all of these key kind of religious connotations, and very, very quickly, and as you go into the early periods of Egypt, it evolves these associations with Osiris, which are certainly in place by the time of the Old Kingdom. So the political past of the place is transfigured into a religious and symbolic presence, and becomes a ceremonial and religious center through the later millennia. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Can I thank Joe Wegner very much? It's been a wonderful talk.